Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.
G'day and Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. I'm Glyn McClean and my genetics are primarily Scottish with a little bit of Irish and a bit of Jewish blood. My clans are Clan Glyn McClean of Duart, which is on my father's side, and on my mother's side it's Clan Keith. My mum's people arrived in New Zealand in 1860 in Oamaru, and they were farmers and blacksmiths primarily. My dad arrived here in 1957, nearly 100 years later, in Wellington, and I have 3 brothers and a sister, most of whom live overseas now, and we shifted all over New Zealand. I went to 12 different schools. My parents met through the Methodist Church here in Wellington, and for my very early childhood, we always said grace at meals. We went to church. My parents went to church. The kids, we went to Sunday school. But at one point, I think when I was about 8 or 9, or one of the times we shifted, I think when we went to Turangi, we just simply didn't get enrolled at Sunday school, and my parents didn't go to church, and we stopped saying grace. And I never found out why. I've not actually asked. So from then on, my upbringing was pretty much very secular, although I tended to gravitate to friends, particularly at school, who were people who had a lot of faith, from various Christian denominations primarily. My attitude was always to them was, I respect your faith, but don't try and convert me, which they were all very good about. Although there was, it wasn't actually till I came to Wellington in the 1980s, after I finished university, that I discovered how important church was actually to my parents. I joined a drama group that I literally picked out of the phone book, which was actually the drama group attached to the Wesley Church, and found that not only were both my parents members, but 2 of my uncles were also founding members. And I didn't know this. One of the women there said to me, first thing she asked was, what church do you go to? And I said, well, I don't. And she said, why is that? And I said, well, I have absolutely no doubt that there is a God, but I just don't feel at all comfortable with many of the teachings that I've come across, and so I don't go to a church. And she just smiled and said, God will bring you to him when he's ready, in his own way, which I thought was pretty cool. Well, how I came to Islam was not at all sort of the usual route from what I gather talking to many other people who have become Muslim. I went to school in New Zealand primarily in the 70s, and that was the era of the Cold War, the doomsday clock waiting for our atomic bombs to go off and world destruction, carless days, and this huge threat we were all told about of communism, that this red threat was going to take over New Zealand and the whole world. And the first New Zealand election that I remember was the infamous Dancing Cossacks election, where Mr Muldoon had these advertisements with Dancing Cossacks saying a vote for Labour was Reds under the bed, and if we voted for Labour the whole country would become communist. And in the 1990s I began to notice that whereas the whole communist thing had sort of faded away with the collapse of the communist empires, that in the 1990s Islam was starting to be portrayed in a very similar manner, but with a very substantial difference. With the whole communism threat, we had a lot of information about, if you like, both sides of the stories. At school, we studied things like the Cultural Revolution in China. We could access Marx and Lenin and Trotsky if we wanted to. Animal Farm was on the New Zealand school curriculum. 1984, quite a lot of things that actually dealt with the sort of whys and wherefores behind it. But with Islam in the 90s, there was nothing. There was just this great big threat. The colour had changed from red to black, but there was almost nothing else. Now, I made the decision to educate myself because I felt that it was, well, completely wrong to basically just have one set of information. And I decided the best way to go about that was to go to the source. I'd studied quite a lot of other religions, and to get away from the sort of dogma of humans, and you get humans running organisation and politics, get involved in all sorts of things. So I always try to go to the most important sources for that phase. So I decided to read the Qur'an. That was easier said than done because I couldn't obtain a copy. There were none in the libraries. The bookshop said they couldn't get me any in. Now, I knew at that time that in Daniel Street in Newtown, there was a house which said Wellington Islamic Centre. It was before we had the mosque. And I didn't doubt that I could wander down there and ask to borrow a Qur'an and someone would lend me one. I didn't because I was very aware that I didn't know how to behave. I didn't want to cause anybody offence. And I mean, I know how to behave on a marae. I know how to behave in a range of Christian churches, from Christadelphian to Catholic to Baptist. I know how to behave at a Samoan funeral, but I had absolutely no idea how to behave when communicating with Muslims, so I didn't do that. I eventually ordered a copy from Amazon.com over the internet, and when it arrived, I expected it to be something completely foreign. I studied Japanese language at university, and I expected the Qur'an to be as foreign to my way of thinking and my entire upbringing as Japanese language is to English. And I was wrong. I was absolutely gobsmacked when I opened this up and started reading about all the stories that I'd been brought up with as a kid. There was Adam and Eve, there was Abraham, there was Hud, there was Jesus, there was Mary, peace be upon them. All the things that had been the cornerstones of my very early upbringing, and very much the sort of value systems that my family had. And yet they were told in a way that answered all the concerns I'd had previously. For example, the decision to take from the tree of knowledge. That was a joint decision. It wasn't some evil woman had actually come in and led this bloke astray. And particularly the Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him. I had always been concerned that from what I was taught at Bible studies and at Sunday school and at church, that everything pointed to the fact that this was a man, an enormously important man, and a man with an incredible message, but a human being. And I'd never been able to reconcile the sort of slide through to divinity, even though the church I was brought up in, we didn't believe in the Trinity, but there was still aspects of divineness being given that I didn't ever feel comfortable with because the stories didn't match. And once I got over my shock, which was pretty massive, my next feeling was to feel ashamed because of my ignorance, and not just my ignorance, but the ignorance of the community in which I lived. And the fact that we were talking about the same God, subhanahu wa ta'ala, the God of Abraham. This is what I would have said previously was New Zealand's God, and yet we didn't even know this. And that was really, really strong. And as I continued to read, it wasn't very long before it became very apparent to me, and I really am insufficiently articulate to express exactly how this felt, but it became very apparent to me that what I was reading was the truth, and the truth in the most profound sense was staring me in the face. I didn't tell anybody else about this at the time. I finished reading the Qur'an, and in translation obviously, and then I read it again. And after the second time through, I decided to do quite a lot of research on the internet and look at how one became Muslim, what one did, how one behaved, and the general implications. And I had a great deal of difficulty finding information other than the very basics, like the 5 pillars. Information about how to pray, those sort of things I actually found quite difficult. This is, again, in the very early 90s, and things have changed since. And I remember finding a couple of articles which said you have to make, and there was an Arabic character. And I was thinking, what's that? And they was talking about, before prayer you make. And I managed to find a translation engine and put it in, and it said wudu, and I thought, okay, so what is this wudu? And it took me probably about another 3 weeks to find that that was ritual cleansing, but it took much, much longer to establish what one actually did and how to actually go about this. And these days, a lot of people are quite shocked that that sort of basic information was very hard to find. And I also found all sorts of sites which said all sorts of things that contradicted each other. But one of the most constant threads throughout was that a conversion to Islam was not something to be done in a hurry. This was something to think about, this was something to research, this was something to be absolutely sure of yourself before you actually took the Shahada. I finally took the Shahada in October 2000, having told my family just a little while before that I was planning to. We made the decision to stay out of the local community initially, and I could say Assalamu alaikum because I found how to say that on the internet, but I couldn't work out how to say wa alaikum assalam. And I used to practice on the Muslim restaurateurs around town saying Assalamu alaikum, but I had to always get in first. So I had to get in there and say Assalamu alaikum before they could say anything. And one of the owners of Tabak, who have now unfortunately gone back to Pakistan, I eventually plucked up enough courage to approach him and ask him if the local community had a website. And he gave me the address and who to contact, because I build websites and we host them. And I sent a letter in to Iman offering to build the website and host it for them if they wanted us to. Now, the building of that website, we actually wanted to try and not just service the local Muslim community in terms of prayer timetables, classes, and detailed education and dawah, but an introduction to Islam for people, for all the information that I had difficulty finding on the internet. And so we actually set this up on the basis that the 3 brothers provided all the information, because obviously I didn't know enough. And we built an introduction area which covered really basic things like how to approach the Qur'an, the concept of God in Islam, the concept of worship in Islam, and they're quite different from in Christianity. Things about attitudes to the afterlife and such like, plus an area of education and dawah with things like detailed things like the verdicts of fasting and the Prophet's night journey, and interfaith area, a detailed article on Islamic dress requirements for men and women. And that was basically my introductory education, because all those pages I scanned. Well, I read them first, then I scanned them, and then I put them into HTML code. That site now has 230 content pages, and we dish up, alhamdulillah, between 200 and 250,000 content pages a year to people all over the world. And it was even listed on, would you believe, the United States Congress Library site as a go-to site on Islam. So if you're wanting to have a look at some of the basics, you can always go to www.iman, that's iman.co.nz. And I owe a huge debt to those 3 brothers for that introduction that I had. It was enormously valuable. My immediate family, because there's only a very small number of them in New Zealand now, because we have dual passports, so we can work in the EU. And those that were left in New Zealand, all 2 of them, were very supportive. My mum, in fact, took me on a business trip to Melbourne with her so I could go and buy hijab clothes, because at that point in time in Wellington there wasn't a shop selling hijab for ladies. And I remember my delight when I went into Brunswick and Melbourne, and there were all these shops selling salami, because salami was one of the things I really missed, because that was about 6 months after I'd become Muslim, and I could buy salami at this shop and this shop and this shop, and I had all sorts of options with clothes. The rest of my family overseas, their attitude initially was, yeah, whatever, fine. But there wasn't any sort of cognizance taken of it. It didn't alter what sort of things they gave me, or whether they gave me Christmas presents, or whether they gave me things that were haram, like I was given a wine holder by one of my relatives. And but a few years ago, that has actually changed over time, as they've sort of worked out that this is not a fad, that this is something that I'm actually living my life as. And a few years ago, one of our family elders, a very conservative lady in Hamilton, she started giving me for Christmas presents headscarves that I thought was just wonderful, and a wonderful compromise, because it honoured her faith in that she was giving a gift to someone she loved at Christmas, and she also honoured mine. And she didn't ever say anything. As far as I'm aware, she's never even commented to me or anyone else about me becoming Muslim. And I just thought that was just wonderful. Of my friends, most of them were, yeah, whatever, you know what you're doing. Whereas there were two who got very deeply concerned. One was the lady who'd told me, nearly 15 years earlier, that I would find my way to God. And she was initially enormously distressed, until it actually occurred to me that I needed to tell her that this was the God of Abraham, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And her first reaction was, no, it's not. And I said, oh, yes, it is. We start with this, and then there's this, and actually went through. There's no way she'd read the Qur'an, but she's come to a point where not only has she accepted that is where I've found peace, but that she can see it's a very good thing. And I think that's huge. One of my other friends, the other one who became very upset initially, and again, she was upset because she was concerned for me. She felt that it was all because of my disability and meant that I was falling apart, and some cult had got hold of me and sort of filled my head with stuff. And she subsequently has also seen how much it's actually calmed and settled me, and how much peace it's given me. It didn't take her very long at all to see that, and that's now not an issue at all. So basically everyone's very accepting of it these days. My decision to wear hijab, it just felt for me to be the natural thing to do. Because of the importance of modesty in Islam, and that's modesty not just for women, but for men, in terms of the way you dress, but in terms of what you do with your wealth, how you show your wealth, all those sort of things. The whole concept of leading a modest life seemed to me that hijab fitted that just perfectly. And it was also very clearly outlined as that was the appropriate way for a woman to behave. And I was very comfortable with that. So I started wearing hijab as soon as I took the Shahada. At that stage, only about 30% of the women in the Wellington community wore hijab, and I realised that later, once I became involved with the community, that a lot of the women were actually receiving quite negative reactions. Whereas I had quite a substantial advantage in the fact that I had blue eyes and white skin. So when people looked at me, because I normally walk with my head down because I have to concentrate on where I'm walking, they would look at me and sort of glare at me, And I'd look up and smile, and they were usually so shocked to see blue eyes and a white face that they just backed off. After September 11, things got very difficult in Wellington for women wearing hijab. Quite often we were actually targeted on the street, and I was personally a couple of times. And the way I responded to that was to try and go out in public with as much open face and as much a smile as I could. Any other woman I saw wearing hijab, I would say Assalamu alaikum to and smile, whether I knew them or not. The one time that it really, really upset me was we went to the airport and people looked frightened. They saw me and I saw fear in their face. And that really, really got to me. And it was actually at that point that I decided that anyone who looked frightened, looked away, or looked aggressive towards me, I would just smile at. And I still do that. And it does actually make a difference. By the time the invasion of Iraq occurred, the sentiment, for want of a better word, on the street had changed quite a lot. In fact, a couple of people came up to me and said, I hope you don't get fallout from this. I really hope that people don't give you a hard time because you're Muslim, which I thought was really nice. I'm self-employed, so I don't need to deal with an employer's attitude, and I'm sure that also made it easier for me. I've only had 2 occasions in shops where people have been really bizarre. One, I was in Palmerston North with a friend of mine and I desperately needed a haircut. And she said, well, my hairdresser, she works from home, it's down the back of her section, she only deals with women, there's no foot traffic, come down there. And so she took me down there and asked her hairdresser if she could fit me in. And the woman looked at me and said, why do you want a haircut? You wear a headscarf. And I sort of said, well, I only wear it out in public, I still want a nice haircut. And she just shook her head and said, no, and walked away, to the horror of my friend, and I sort of thought, whatever. The other sort of quite funny incident was when I went to buy my wetsuit, because I like to kayak, and I wear hijab when I'm kayaking. I wear my wetsuit on underneath my hijab, and then I wear my spray skirt on top of that, and then I wear my life jacket on top of that, and my headscarf, and usually a sun hat. And okay, it looks odd, but I get to go kayaking. And it was one of those really sort of hip, cool shops which primarily deal with teenagers and body surfers in Lambton Quay who had a sale on for wetsuits. And I went in and found one that looked like it might fit and tried to get the attention of the lady to say, you know, I'd like to try this on. And she just kept ignoring me. The shop was empty, except for her and her boss. And I finally said, look, I want to try this on, because the changing sheds were corrugated iron or something and they weren't obvious. And she said, why? And I said, well, I want to find out if it fits me. I mean, she was only about 20. And she said, well, why? And I said, well, I want to go kayaking. Is that the changing room? Can I go in there, please? And so I went in and got changed. And as I did, I heard her boss, who would have been all of sort of 22, come over and tell her off, and that you don't ever make assessments or assumptions on the basis of what people are wearing. And what was most interesting to me, I mean, he did it so strongly, I actually felt sorry for her. But what was most interesting to me was his primary concern was not that she might have missed a sale, but that she treated somebody badly. And that enormously impressed me. And I've been hugely impressed by the younger generations. Even around the time of September 11, I had sort of 13-year-olds coming up to me and saying, okay, that means you're one of them. Why is that? And having a very open attitude and listening to what I actually had to say. And at the end of it saying, oh yeah, okay, whatever, that's cool. And sort of wafting on their way. The other thing about hijab for me is I found it enormously freeing. Not just because I'd never have a bad hair day, but I became disabled in my 20s, and since I was about 24 I've walked with a walking stick. And prior to wearing hijab, people would always look at my walking stick and say, oh, you've hurt your leg. And I'd say, no, I'm disabled. And then they'd want my entire medical history, and basically the only conversation would be what I couldn't do, what was wrong with me. Whereas since I've been wearing hijab, the people that do notice it are much more interested in me these days and why I made the decision to become Muslim and what it's like being Muslim and those sort of things. And I've just found that hugely freeing. I, in the 80s, was working in a job where you had to power dress. I had to wear a different suit to work every single day. And then in the early 90s, I was working for another outfit and they decided that we had to wear uniforms, the staff. The staff was 50-50 women and men. And then it turned out at the meetings they only wanted to put the girls in a uniform. And we were the one who wore suits to work and the men could just wear jeans. And I just don't have any of those hassles anymore. And it does really focus people in on you as a person. I often hear people getting very upset on the media, sort of saying, well, you know, this is aggressive and this is not New Zealand and this is all sorts of things. And my response to that is always, I was born and bred in this country, and as long as I can remember, everyone has been allowed to wear whatever they like as long as they follow basic standards of decency. So why does it matter to anyone else why I wear this? I'm not asking you to. And I really find that sort of getting stressed out about it very odd, and always have done. In New Zealand, I think Islam can offer hope. That's one of the most important things that it gave to me. We have one of the highest youth suicide rates in the world, and too often so many large portions of our population are being told they're failures. I was brought up that the road to hell was paved with good intentions. Islam, it is completely different. In Islam, your intentions are valued, your intentions are rewarded, your intentions are everything. So if you do something and your intentions are good but you actually don't execute it properly and you get it wrong, you aren't a complete failure. You actually have achieved right up to the point where it actually went wrong. Yes, you still have to deal with whatever mess it might have created going wrong, but you're not a failure. And I think that is something that New Zealanders are very bad at doing, is giving credit where credit's actually due, even when it's in small amounts, and it's small amounts that can give people hope. I also think that I remember when I was very small at a Sunday school class being told about crabs and how it was so easy for Christians to be crabs. We would be taught to walk straight on Saturdays and we'd walk sideways all the rest of the week. What Islam provides through the fact that it is actually tailored for humanity, it understands human frailties and human weaknesses. And for example, if your meal is ready and it's time to pray, you eat, then you pray. If you need the loo and it's time to pray, you go to the loo and then you pray. And the whole structure of having the 5 daily prayers means that if you've started to walk sideways, even partway through your day, when it's time for salat, for prayer, it just focuses back in again, calms things down and puts you back on the right track. And all the way through, you're being given the opportunities to follow a peaceful Islamic lifestyle. And it's actually not at conflict. There's no concept of original sin, that you start off bad and you've got to try and be good and chances are you're going to be bad anyway. You actually start off as good as you can possibly be, and it's a matter of trying to maintain that throughout your life. I recently read an extraordinary book called Salmon Fishing in Yemen, and the Sheikh character in that book, he made the statement that faith comes before love and before hope. And I think that is just so true. And Islam is a faith that allows you to keep shoring yourself up all the way along. And there's been a huge increase in knowledge since the September 11 attacks. I mean, they were absolutely horrific and I shudder at the very thought of them. And if some good has come out of them, it has been a greater awareness of Islam, and not just from people wanting to find out about it, but also from Muslims making it more available. Because so many Muslims have been brought up Muslim, Islam is like what they were taught at home, and because of the very big difference between Christianity and Islam, in that if you ask a Christian person to tell them about original sin, or to tell them about Jesus and Mary, peace be upon them, they'll tell you. If you ask them what their faith is about, they'll tell you. If you ask a Muslim, they'll say, I'm not a scholar, which was interpreted in quite a different way from how it was actually meant. All that they were actually saying when they say, I'm not a scholar, which is what I say these days, is that I am not best qualified to answer that question. Whereas what I think the Muslim community in New Zealand has become much better at is then providing information as to who to go and talk to, or where this information actually is available. I've found no conflict between being Kiwi and Muslim, none whatsoever. If I was working for somebody else, there could be difficulty praying Asr, that's the afternoon prayer. It would be quite easy to fit in all the others, and I imagine from the people that I've worked for over the years that the only difficulty would be where you actually go to pray, because most places you can take a 5 or 10 minute break. Most Kiwi employers, my employers have primarily been small business, tend to be comfortable employing people who look like them and behave like them. But that has changed enormously even in the last 10 years. For example, my hairdresser, who I was the first Muslim she'd ever met, she's now employing a Muslim girl, alhamdulillah, and a hijab wearing Muslim girl too, in a hairdressing salon. And it's working out very well, alhamdulillah. And she actually said to me the hairdresser said to me last time I was in there, because she always gives me the last appointment, she makes sure there's no other clients around, she always puts the blinds down, those sort of things. She said, you know, I would have missed out on employing her if it hadn't been for you, because it simply wouldn't have occurred to her. Too often it's interpreted as being racist, whereas more often than not, it's a matter of the same problem that I had initially with not wanting to go to the Islamic Centre, simply not knowing how to behave and not giving offence. I mean, New Zealand is largely a very inclusive and accepting place, which is often undervalued, I think. When I went to Melbourne in 2000, and this is before September 11, within half an hour of getting off the plane, I was wearing hijab, I got spat at. And even at the very worst of times here in Wellington, that's never happened in New Zealand. And I think it's very important that we don't allow ourselves to be ghettoised, and that Muslims keep interacting with non-Muslims, because in Melbourne, you literally turn a corner from one suburb to the next. In one suburb you won't see anyone wearing hijab. You turn the corner, and not only are there salami selling halal butchers, but there are women in headscarves and men in Islamic dress all the way down the street. And yet, a block away, you won't see one. And I was told many times on that short trip that I was in an area, because I was staying in South Yarra, that Muslims shouldn't be staying in. And I think that's a lesson for New Zealand Muslims and non-Muslims alike, that we need not to get in that situation.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.